A third impeachment is back on the table, plus whispers of the 25th Amendment. And the clock is ticking. What changed? Who moved first? And how did America end up here again? Let's roll the tape, because the first clue appeared months before anyone said the word impeachment out loud. In late April, a first-term Democrat from Michigan, Sri Fanadar, walked a resolution into the House that most people didn't expect to see so soon. 7 articles to impeach President Donald Trump during his second term. The text didn't wobble or hedge. It accused him of obstructing justice, hijacking Congress's power over money, abusing trade rules, trampling free speech, building an unlawful office, taking bribes, and, note the choice of word, tyranny. This wasn't a cable news hot take. It was a formal filing, logged, stamped, and sent to judiciary. That planted the seed. Lawmakers now had a document they could point to the minute new facts piled up, and they did. But the story didn't break wide open until September 22nd. That afternoon, the White House posted an executive order claiming Antifa was now a domestic terrorist organization. If that phrase sounds strange to you, you're not alone. The United States has a clear playbook for terrorist designations, and it runs through the State Department for foreign groups, not the Oval Office for domestic movements. Antifa isn't even a single group. It's a loose idea that different people use in different ways. Overnight, legal experts called it unprecedented. The order didn't explain how agencies would enforce it because there isn't a standard for domestic terror lists like there is for foreign lists under EO 13224. That gap isn't a technicality. It's the fence line between we can freeze assets and do warrantless stuff now, and no, you can't invent powers by press release. And here's where it gets wild. The move set up the next big collision inside the Justice Department. 1 month later, a veteran federal prosecutor in Virginia told colleagues she didn't see probable cause to charge New York's Attorney General, Letitia James, with mortgage fraud. She said the evidence was weak and the push looked political. That is a career-limiting sentence in any administration. Soon after, the top prosecutor overseeing the case, U.S. Attorney Eric Sieber, resigned under pressure after the president said he wanted him out. 2 senior lawyers were then fired from the same office for resisting an indictment many inside DOJ thought would collapse in court. This was not Twitter rumor. It showed up in filings, memos, and then in a courtroom when James pleaded not guilty and a judge scheduled a trial. Now the issue wasn't just, is the Antifa order legal? It was, are prosecutors being forced to weaponize it and other tools against political enemies? You thought that was big? Try this. Those internal fights set off alarms far beyond one case. At the same time, a federal judge in San Francisco slammed the brakes on mass layoffs of more than 4,000 federal workers during the shutdown, calling the move reckless and hinting it might be illegal. That ruling didn't just protect jobs. It told agencies, if you're firing people to score political points during a funding standoff, the courts will step in. For lawmakers who are already staring at the Antifa order and the James case, this looked like a pattern. One branch grabbing power, another branch trying to pull it back, and the system heating up. That's when the impeachment talk turned from might to when. Let me tell you this. Impeachment is both a legal tool and a political signal. In July and August, most Democrats kept their powder dry. They knew a failed impeachment could make a president stronger. They had watched that movie before. But after the Antifa order, the prosecutor resignations, and the layoff injunction, activists and constitutional groups started publishing fresh memos with a simple message. The red lines aren't abstract anymore. Free Speech for People, one of the earliest groups to push impeachment years ago, posted new arguments that what they called treasonous or warfare-like acts against the system were now chargeable. Plenty of scholars disagreed with that language, but the point stood. The conduct list was growing, and the mechanics of government were getting bent to breaking.
But wait, this next part changes everything. As pressure rose in Congress, a second drumbeat started inside the executive branch. Quiet talk of the 25th Amendment. On paper, Section 4 lets the vice president and a majority of the cabinet say the president can't do the job, temporarily handing power to the vice president. In reality, it's never been used against a resisting president, and most experts believe the system is built to protect the president from that kind of internal ambush. Still, the fact that major outlets were publishing explainers in October about how the 25th would work and whether it was realistic told you where Washington's head was. The conversation had left think tank panels and moved into rooms with people who wear badges. So how did we get from a spring resolution to fall crisis? Rewind to January and February. The new administration had made it clear it would revisit score-settling fights from the past, investigations into Biden-era climate money, cold cases tied to 2016 and 2020, and the prosecutions of January 6 rioters. Inside DOJ, several career officials complained about pressure to open grand juries on thin evidence. One senior prosecutor in DC even resigned, saying she wouldn't chase conspiracy theories around EPA grants. That mattered because DOJ culture runs on norms. If line lawyers think leadership is bending rules, they quit, they leak, or they ask courts for shelter. That's the kind of slow-building paper-cut damage that doesn't trend on social media, but moves history. Back to Congress. The NARDER's April resolution had 7 distinct articles. That number wasn't random. It let Democrats test several lanes at once. Oversight fights over money, speech, trade, a mysterious, unlawful office, and classic bribery claims. Think of it like a diversified portfolio of allegations. If one article fizzled, another could carry the day. The Judiciary Committee didn't sprint. It gathered public statements, agency guidance, and internal watchdog letters. Most of that stayed quiet until September's Antifa order handed them a clean storyline. The president had tried to invent a domestic terror list with no law behind it, then leaned on prosecutors to chase a political rival, then tried to chop the civil service during a shutdown, and judges and career officials were pushing back each time. That's not 3 random events. That's one narrative arc a staff lawyer can summarize in a memo to a member who has a 5-minute cable hit at 8 p.m. And here's where it gets wild. The Antifa order didn't just raise civil liberties concerns. Business groups and risk lawyers started asking practical questions. Who counts as material support? A donor who bought t-shirts? A bookstore that carried an Antifa-themed zine? Banks weren't sure whether to flag accounts. Police chiefs asked whether the order authorized new surveillance. Akeem Gump's policy team published a tracker note, and law firms began issuing client alerts explaining that domestic designations had no clear statutory track. When lawyers in K Street suites are telling clients, "We don't know how this will be used," markets hear one thing: uncertainty. The White House framed the order as a promise kept after the killing of a right-wing activist sparked a national flashpoint. The problem was, investigators hadn't tied that violence to Antifa, and even if they had, executive orders can't create new criminal categories out of thin air. If a president wants a domestic terror list, Congress has to write that law. That's not a partisan point. It's a separation of powers point. Without it, agencies are stuck. They can posture, they can talk tough, but when they try to act, judges ask the same question: show me the statute.
But what if I told you the real fuse wasn't the Antifa order itself? It was how fast DOJ moved against Letitia James after it. Within weeks, the political pressure went public. Siebert resigned. 2 top lawyers got fired. James was indicted in the Eastern District of Virginia on 2 counts. She pleaded not guilty and called the case political retribution. Then a different federal judge, in a different case, warned prosecutors in yet another high-profile matter, James Comey's case, to turn over grand jury materials and stop playing discovery games. A theme was forming across courtrooms. Judges weren't buying the trust us vibe. They wanted receipts. Inside the West Wing, allies shrugged. Presidents pressured DOJ all the time. They point to Nixon, Reagan, even Obama critics who said he nudged prosecutors. The counter is simple. Nudging isn't the same as punishing. When firings and demotions follow refusals to bring weak cases, it crosses a line. That's why the House keeps a shelf full of subpoenas, and inspectors general collect emails like baseball cards. You don't need a smoking gun memo that says, "Indict my enemy." A timeline of pressure, personnel moves, and public statements can paint the same picture. But wait, the next part changes everything. After the layoffs ruling, union lawyers and public interest groups filed more suits. Some asked for temporary restraining orders. Others demanded records of White House DOJ contacts. At the same time, advocacy groups revived impeachment campaigns and started rallying donors around a 3rd impeachment. The number 3 mattered. No president had been impeached twice and then faced a 3rd try. This was not normal politics. It was the system trying to set a hard boundary after softer boundaries failed. Some scholars warned that pushing too hard could make impeachment look routine. Others said the opposite. Not acting would normalize the behavior. That split wasn't just in academia. It ran right through swing district Democrats staring down midterms. Let's pause and explain the 25th in plain English.
Impeachment is a charge and a trial. It starts in the House, needs a majority there, then 2/3 in the Senate to convict. The 25th Amendment is a safety valve for incapacity, medical, mental, or functional. The vice president and most of the cabinet sign a letter saying the president can't do the job. The vice president becomes acting president right away. The president can contest it, then Congress votes. If 2/3 of both chambers back the cabinet, the vice president keeps acting power. If not, the president returns. It's fast by design because it's meant for emergencies, but it's also politically radioactive. Cabinet members who try it might end their careers. That's why experts were skeptical it would ever happen here, and why the more likely path was still impeachment. So the House started lining up witnesses. Agency lawyers walked in with binders. A former DOJ official explained how charging memos are supposed to work. A labor economist ran the numbers on mass layoffs during a shutdown, translating legalese into human impact. A national security lawyer testified that slapping the terrorist label on a domestic movement without a law behind it puts police and businesses in a legal no man's land. Meanwhile, the White House communications machine did what it does. It reframed, it attacked, it called the whole thing a witch hunt. That word has been overused for years, but it still rallies a base. The bigger question was never the soundbite. It was whether the paper trail would hold up in front of a court or a Senate jury.
Across town, one more thread pulled tight. Think tanks and law schools pointed out that domestic terror designations, if they start by executive order, can expand fast. If Antifa is just a label, who decides the next label? A protest network? A media collective? A union that backs a strike? Even businesses worry here, because risk teams hate ambiguous rules. If any donation or vendor contract might get flagged, companies start over-compliance. That's a quiet tax on speech and association. It chills people who aren't even the target. You don't need to agree with Antifa to see the slope. You just need to like clear laws. But what if I told you? The suspense at this point wasn't just about the House vote or a cabinet letter. It was about time. October had flipped the calendar into a dangerous zone. Midterms less than a year out. Lawmakers back in their districts on weekends, reading polls and town hall emails. Delay too long and the story hardens. Move too fast and you lose moderates. This is the part of the movie where the score gets tense, because every day without a decision is still a decision. It tells the White House, the agencies, and the world what Congress is willing to stomach. To keep momentum without burning swing votes, Democrats aim for structure. Staff wrote a narrative that even a casual viewer could follow. A timeline that started with a spring impeachment filing, moved through a fall executive order with no statutory base, slid into a federal case that smelled political, and hit a judge's ruling that stopped mass layoffs in their tracks. They wanted a story you could tell in 3 minutes on the House floor and in 30 seconds on TikTok. They needed to sound measured, not manic. They brought in former Republican officials who could say, "We'd be worried about this no matter who was president." That kind of witness buys credibility you can't get from your own side. And here's where it gets wild. The White House leaned into a counter story. It said the Antifa order was about safety. It said the James case was about equal justice. It said the layoffs were an unfortunate temporary step during a shutdown caused by Democrats. Then it pointed to every judge's ruling it liked and ignored the ones it didn't. If you've watched American politics since 2016, you know the playbook. Fight everywhere, concede nowhere, keep your base angry and energized. It works until the audience becomes a jury. Then you need documents, you need testimony that doesn't crumble, you need, at minimum, one surprise that cuts your way. The administration's surprise was the indictment itself. For weeks, "there's no case" was the talking point from critics. Suddenly, there was a case, a docket number, a judge in a robe. Whether it holds is the next act. While that legal fight prepared to unfold, House investigators reached for something they learned the last 2 times. Don't overpromise. The Senate is a brick wall unless you bring Republicans along. And you won't bring Republicans along if your evidence depends on reading minds or inferring motives. So they focused on process. That's a boring word, but it wins. If you can show a process was unlawful, say designating a domestic enemy by executive order when Congress never granted that power, you don't need to prove why. You just need to prove how. Same with the layoffs. If rules for reductions in force were ignored, motive becomes less important. Courts fix process first.
As hearings rolled, something else shifted. Newsrooms started publishing explainers without adjectives. No bombshell, no meltdown, just timelines, quotes, and case numbers.
That's a tell. When editors strip the emotion, it usually means the facts stand on their own. If you're producing a video, you know this is where viewers lean in because they can track the story without feeling lectured. The trick is to slow down just enough to let each beat land, then speed up before attention drifts. Think date, action, response. Date, action, response. Spring resolution, September order, October resignations and firings, October injunction, late October arraignment, early November discovery warning in a separate DOJ case. That rhythm builds pressure because each step answers one question but asks another. So where does impeachment fit? House leaders looked at the count. A majority to impeach was within reach. The Senate was a long shot. That's math and culture. Conviction needs 2/3. That means you need Republicans to say yes in a body where partisan loyalty is the air people breathe. Could that change? Maybe, if the evidence shows direct orders to prosecute a rival against DOJ guidance, or emails tying the Antifa order to a plan to criminalize protests. Maybe if judges keep calling out rule breaking. Maybe if more prosecutors quit and say why on camera. Until then, the play is to pass a clean, narrow set of articles that a few Republicans can live with, or at least can't easily swat away on TV. Meanwhile, the 25th talk stayed a ghost story. Experts kept reminding people that it's designed to fail unless the case is obvious and the cabinet is united. It protects the president on purpose. That's why even if some officials wargame the paperwork, the odds were always low. But the mere fact it was being gamed told you trust inside the system was thin. No one rehearses a parachute drill unless they're worried the plane might stall. You thought the stakes were big already? Try this. If the House impeaches and the Senate acquits again, America sets a new precedent. A president could be impeached 3 times and still finish a term. That normalization is a double-edged sword. On one side, it says the system can absorb stress. On the other, it might tell future presidents that the cost of breaking norms is survivable. That's not fear-mongering, that's just how incentives work. If you own a business and get fined once for a practice that makes you 10 times the fine, you do the math. Politics isn't different. The goal of impeachment isn't just punishment, it's deterrence. If deterrence fails, the next person will test the fence again. There's one more layer, and it's less dramatic but just as important: administration capacity. Every time officials are fired for refusing weak cases or forced out for telling the truth in memos, the government loses muscle memory. Agencies have rules because people who came before learned the hard way what happens when you don't. If those people leave, you don't just lose morale, you lose knowledge. That's why mass layoffs during a shutdown are so dangerous. They don't just remove positions, they remove expertise you can't get back fast. Judges know this. That's why the TRO landed so fast. It wasn't a speech, it was an emergency break. But wait, this next part changes everything. Watch the next hearings for 3 things. First, any document that shows the Antifa order was meant to skirt Congress on purpose. A draft that says, "We know there's no domestic designation law, but," would be a political earthquake. Second, any testimony that the White House tied career reviews or promotions to an indictment on Letitia James. That turns a debate about discretion into a case about coercion. Third, any sign that the layoff plan was designed not to save money, but to punish agencies that didn't toe the line. One email can flip a narrative.
Also watch for small moves that hint at big shifts. A Republican committee lawyer asking friendlier questions than last week, a judge fast-tracking a FOIA suit for White House DOJ communications, a cabinet secretary giving a speech about constitutional duty that reads like a Rorschach test, a mid-level resignation that mentions recent actions without specifics. In DC, vague exits often aren't vague at all. They're exit signs with the power cords cut. Let's talk tone for a second, because it matters for outcomes.
If Democrats sound vengeful, they lose the middle. If Republicans sound bored by process, they lose the institutionalist wing that still cares about rules. The winning voice for either side is simple, specific, and a little humble. We checked, here are the rules, here's where they were broken. Here's the document, here's the date, here's the witness. No adjectives required. That steady pace beats viral anger in the long game. And yes, I know this is YouTube and we like heat, but in Washington, cold cases, the ones built with eights, exhibits, and calm voices, are the ones that stick. So what about Warren Buffett? People have to ask how an investor reads politics. He said versions of the same thing for decades. You judge systems by what they do when nobody's watching and by how they behave when stress hits. Markets can price risk. They can't price chaos. You don't need to agree with his politics to get the point. A government that follows rules, even when it hurts, is cheaper to run. Investors like cheap. They hate surprise rules, and they really hate rules that change with a speech. You want to know why traders force refresh legal blogs during weeks like this? Because rules are the rails. If the rails wobble, everything wobbles. If you're looking for a clean ending, I don't have one for you yet. That's not a cop-out. It's the truth about where the story sits tonight. The House has a resolution with 7 articles ready to dust off. A controversial executive order is on the books drawing legal fire. A federal case against a prominent political rival is moving toward trial. Judges have already thrown flags, prosecutors have resigned and been fired. And inside the executive branch, some people have opened a very old, very heavy door labeled 25th, just to see if the hinges still move. Each of those beats is strong on its own. Together, they form a drumline you can hear from blocks away. Here's the curiosity loop I promised at the start. If a third impeachment lands, what matters more, the vote count or the record it builds for the next presidency? If the Senate acquits, does the House move to bar future office through a separate vote if a conviction ever comes? If courts strike the Antifa order, do agencies retreat or try a new path with different words? If the James case collapses, do firings turn into wrongful termination suits that force discovery on DOJ communications with the White House? Each answer leads to a new question, and that's the point. This isn't one story, it's a set of branching stories all tied to one test. Can the system police itself when the stakes are highest? Let me leave you with one scene. A committee staffer sits in a windowless room, scrolling through emails that look boring until you read them in order. A deputy counsel drafts a sentence at 11:08 p.m. A chief of staff replies at 6:41 a.m. A calendar invite appears for a meeting titled Policy Coordination, the kind of name that hides more than it says. 90% of American politics never makes TV. It lives in those little choices, the ones nobody notices until a judge asks for them. That's where this story will finish, either in a thick binder that convinces enough senators to cross the aisle, or in a thinner binder that still draws a line for history and says, we saw this, we measured it, and we set a marker.
You thought that was big? Try this. Whatever happens next won't just decide one presidency. It will teach the next one what is safe to try. If the House moves and the Senate doesn't, the lesson will be, you can push hard and live. If judges keep blocking and prosecutors keep walking, the lesson will be, process still wins. If a cabinet letter ever surfaces, even one drafted and never sent, the lesson will be, people inside had doubts, and that matters. We don't get to choose the lesson, we only get to tell the story as it unfolds, calmly, with dates, with documents, and with enough patience to let the facts carry the weight. And here's the part that might age best. Systems build trust the same way bank accounts build money. Slowly, with steady deposits. They lose it fast. The last decade has been a masterclass in withdrawals. Impeachment is a dramatic tool, but the quieter tools, internal dissent, inspector general reports, court orders, are the ones that refill the account. If they hold this time, you'll see it in boring ways first. Memos that follow the template, meetings that start with, what does the statute say? And a bureaucracy that doesn't flinch when a powerful person yells. That's not a great thumbnail for a video, but it's a great thumbnail for a country that still knows how to follow its own rules. So keep your eye on 3 clocks: the House schedule, the court calendars, and the election countdown. One will move first, the others will react. When the next shoe drops, be it a vote, a ruling, or a resignation, we'll update the timeline and ask the same question we've asked since spring. Did this action make the rails steadier or weaker?
Because at the end of the day, impeachment isn't just about one person. It's about whether the rails still hold the train. And that answer, for better or for worse, will be the headline future generations read when they ask what we did when the rules got tested.